What if everything we've been told about Angkor Wat is incomplete? What if the temple we see, magnificent as it is only the surface of something far stranger, far older, far more sophisticated than medieval construction should allow? The dust still clung to my boots when I first ran my fingers across stone that shouldn't float, when my compass started spinning in corridors where magnetic fields pulse with no apparent source, when I discovered faces carved into walls that change expression with the seasons. I came to Cambodia expecting to document one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. What I found instead were questions that conventional archaeology can't answer. How did 12th century builders create acoustic systems that rival modern concert halls? Why does the temple align perfectly with star positions from 10,500 BCE, 8,000 years before it was supposedly built? What lies in the sealed chamber 30 meters beneath the central tower, the chamber that swallowed 3 researchers who never returned? Why did master carvers abandon their finest work mid-chisel? How did engineers master vortex flow dynamics 6 centuries before Europe discovered the principle? I've spent months mapping anomalies that shouldn't exist, stones that defy gravity, plants from Madagascar growing in Cambodian corridors for 400 years, ceramic vessels hidden in patterns that mirror Orion, melted walls that suggest directed energy, Serpent balustrades pointing to ruins no map acknowledges. 15 mysteries. 15 pieces of a puzzle we're only beginning to see. This is not the story they tell in guidebooks. This is what Angkor Wat reveals when you stop accepting easy answers and start asking uncomfortable questions. Welcome to the temple that refuses to make sense. Let me show you what hides in plain sight. The first time I ran my fingers across the dancing Apsara relief in the Western Gallery, something felt wrong. The stone was too smooth, too precise, as if carved yesterday rather than 9 centuries ago. But what stopped me cold was the section where a massive sandstone block appears to float, suspended without visible support, defying every principle of medieval construction. Local stonemasons refused to explain it. They simply pointed upward and walked away. I have stood beneath this particular block more times than I can count, watching sunlight shift across its surface, waiting for the illusion to break. It never does. The block weighs approximately 8 tons, carved from a single piece of sandstone, hovering in a doorway of the Western Gallery like a frozen impossibility. No mortar binds it, no metal brackets support it, no hidden framework props it up. Ground-penetrating radar confirms what my eyes tell me. There's nothing there. Just air and somehow stone that shouldn't have been taken. Modern engineers have examined it with laser scanners and structural analysis software. Their conclusion? Based on the block's weight distribution and the absence of load-bearing support, it should have collapsed centuries ago. The center of gravity sits outside the visible contact points with surrounding stones. Physics textbooks would call this impossible. Yet here it stands, or rather, here it floats, defying gravity with the quiet arrogance of ancient knowledge we've somehow lost. But this isn't the only one. As I explored deeper into the temple complex, I found 7 more blocks exhibiting similar properties. Each one positioned in doorways or archways, each one appearing to violate basic structural mechanics. What's more disturbing is their placement. When I mapped their locations and connected them with GPS coordinates, they formed a pattern, not random architectural quirks, but deliberate positioning following a geometric design I couldn't quite decipher. The local guides have stories, of course. They speak of master builders who knew the songs that made stone light, who could whisper to rock and make it obey. Romantic legends, I thought at first, but after spending months studying Khmer construction techniques, I'm not so sure anymore. The mathematical precision required to balance these blocks, even with modern equipment, would be extraordinary. To do it with 12th century tools, with no apparent calculation errors, no trial runs, no failures, it suggests knowledge that shouldn't have existed. I consulted with a structural engineer from Singapore who specializes in historical construction. She reviewed my photographs and measurements in silence for nearly an hour before speaking. Her words still echo in my mind. This isn't just advanced for its time. This is advanced for our time. If we tried to replicate this today, we'd need computer modeling, stress analysis, and probably a dozen failed attempts. They did it once, perfectly, and left no record of how. The question that keeps me awake isn't just how they did it, it's why. Why demonstrate mastery over gravity in subtle doorways where most visitors would never notice? Why hide this impossible achievement in plain sight? Carved into a temple that already showcases countless artistic and architectural marvels. Unless, of course, the floating stones weren't meant to impress. They were meant to preserve something, a technique, a principle, a message in stone for those who knew how to read it. And if they could make stone float, what else could they do? What other secrets are hidden in these walls, waiting for someone to ask the right questions? The deeper I dig into Angkor Wat's mysteries, the more I realize the floating block isn't an anomaly. It's an invitation. I discovered it by accident standing in the exact center of the central sanctuary at dawn. When I tapped my chest, the sound didn't just echo, it transformed. A single note became a resonant hum that filled the entire chamber, as if the temple itself was breathing. Ancient texts mention this phenomenon as the voice of the gods. Modern acousticians have measured it, analyzed it, and still can't explain how 12th century builders created a resonance chamber this sophisticated. The effect is so precise that it only works from one specific spot. Move half a meter in any direction and the phenomenon disappears entirely. But stand in that exact location, marked now by centuries of wear on the stone floor, and the temple becomes an instrument. A whisper amplifies into a chorus. A hand clap reverberates for 7 full seconds, each echo slightly different in pitch, creating harmonics that shouldn't be possible in a stone chamber. I brought recording equipment on my third visit, professional-grade microphones used in concert halls. The frequency analysis revealed something extraordinary. The chamber amplifies sounds between 200 and 400 hertz, the exact range of the human voice during chanting or deep meditation. It suppresses higher frequencies, filtering out ambient noise and creating an acoustic environment of profound clarity. This isn't accidental architecture, this is deliberate acoustic engineering. But here's what keeps me up at night. When monks chant in the central tower during ceremonies, the sound doesn't just amplify locally. It propagates through the entire temple complex in ways that violate normal acoustic behavior. I placed sensors at 5 different locations, each separated by hundreds of meters and multiple stone walls. When the chanting began, all 5 locations registered the same frequency simultaneously, with no time delay. Sound doesn't work that way. It travels at a fixed speed, roughly 340 meters per second. There should have been measurable delays between each sensor. There weren't. A physicist friend suggested the temple might be acting as a waveguide. channeling sound through hidden passages or structural features. We spent 2 weeks mapping every corridor, every gallery, every conceivable path sound could travel. We found nothing that explained it. The acoustic propagation seems to bypass normal physics entirely, as if the temple was designed to resonate as a single unified structure rather than a collection of separate chambers. What's more fascinating is how the effect changes with the seasons. During the dry season, the resonance peaks at certain frequencies. During monsoon season, when humidity saturates the sandstone, different frequencies amplify instead. It's as if the temple was designed to interact with atmospheric conditions, creating a living acoustic environment that breathes with the weather itself. Ancient Khmer texts describe the central tower as the axis mundi, the cosmic center where heaven and earth connect. I always assumed this was purely symbolic, but after experiencing the acoustic phenomenon firsthand, I'm not certain anymore. When you stand in that spot, with the temple humming around you, amplifying your voice into something that feels larger than human, it's difficult not to feel you're touching something beyond ordinary architecture. The question that haunts me is this: how did 12th century builders, working without computers or acoustic modeling software, create resonance chambers with precision that rivals modern concert halls? And why? What purpose did this serve beyond ritual? Because as I traced those impossible sound waves through stone corridors, I began to suspect the acoustic properties weren't just for ceremony. They were a technology we've forgotten how to read. And if sound could travel through these walls in ways that defy physics, what else might be traveling through them that we simply can't detect? They told me the temple faced east, aligned with the equinox sunrise. What they didn't tell me was how perfectly it aligned with Draco constellation in 10,500 BCE, over 8,000 years before it was supposedly built. I stood on the western causeway with my compass and star charts, calculating the precession of equinoxes. The numbers didn't lie. Either this was an extraordinary coincidence or someone encoded a date into the stones that predates known Khmer civilization by millennia. The precession of equinoxes is Earth's slow wobble on its axis, a cycle that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. This wobble changes which stars appear above any given location on specific dates. It's predictable, measurable, and most importantly, it's reversible. Using astronomical software, you can calculate exactly where any constellation appeared at any point in history. When I ran the calculations for Angkor Wat's orientation, the results stopped me cold. The temple's main axis doesn't just point east. It points to the exact position where Draco constellation would have risen on the spring equinox 10,500 years ago. Not approximately, not close enough for coincidence. Precisely aligned, down to fractions of a degree. The same date, I realized with growing unease, that appears encoded in other ancient structures. The Sphinx, the pyramids of Giza, Göbekli Tepe, all pointing to the same impossible era. I checked my calculations 3 times, convinced I'd made an error. I hadn't. I consulted with an astronomer who specializes in archaeoastronomy, sending her the measurements without context. Her response came back within hours. Whatever this structure is aligning to, it's not from the medieval period. The stellar positions match late Pleistocene epoch. She had no idea she was analyzing Angkor Wat. But here's where it gets stranger. The temple also aligns perfectly with the spring equinox sunrise in 1115 CE, the year construction began according to historical records. So we have two alignments, two dates, both encoded in the same structure. One from recorded history, one from a time when Cambodia was supposedly inhabited by hunter-gatherers with no knowledge of monumental architecture or advanced astronomy. The conventional explanation is coincidence. The builders aimed for the equinox, and the ancient stellar alignment is just mathematical accident. But I've worked with enough ancient sites to know that civilizations don't build monuments this massive, this precise, this expensive, without intention. Every angle matters. Every alignment carries meaning. To dismiss this as coincidence requires ignoring the extraordinary mathematical precision involved. I walked the causeway at dawn during the spring equinox, watching the sun rise exactly along the temple's axis. The alignment was perfect, just as the historian said. But as darkness gave way to light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on something far older than the stones around me. That perhaps the Khmer builders weren't creating something new, but reconstructing something ancient, rebuilding on foundations that carried knowledge from an age we've erased from our history books. There's a growing theory among researchers, whispered more than published, that some ancient sites mark catastrophic events, that the alignment to 10,500 BCE isn't random because something happened then. Something significant enough that survivors wanted future generations to remember the date, to encode it in stone across multiple continents. If that's true, then Angkor Wat isn't just a temple. It's a time marker, a memorial. And if the builders knew enough to encode a date 8,000 years before their time, what else did they know? What other secrets are hidden in these alignments, waiting for someone to ask not just how they built it, but when they were really building it for? In the southern gallery, I found something that shouldn't exist. An incomplete carving, abandoned mid-chisel. But here's what haunts me. The unfinished section shows detail and technique that surpasses the completed portions around it. It's as if the most skilled artisan suddenly stopped, mid-stroke, and never returned. No historical record explains why. No legend accounts for the gap. Just smooth stone where intricate narrative should be. The bas-relief stretches for 30 meters along the gallery wall, depicting the churning of the ocean of milk, one of Angkor Wat's most famous narratives. Gods and demons pulling on the Serpent Vasuki, churning the cosmic ocean to obtain the elixir of immortality. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, each figure carved with such precision that you can see individual fingers gripping the serpent's scales, facial expressions showing strain and determination. And then, abruptly, it stops. What makes this truly bizarre is the transition zone. There's a section, roughly 2 meters wide, where the carving becomes impossibly detailed. The stone practically breathes with life. Individual scales on the serpent show wear patterns suggesting age. The musculature of the figures reveals an understanding of human anatomy that surpasses anything else in the temple. And the depth of the relief work, the way light plays across multiple carved layers, demonstrates three-dimensional thinking that seems centuries ahead of its time. I measured the chisel marks under magnification. The unfinished section was carved with tools that left smoother, more precise cuts than the completed portions. Either the artisan switched to superior instruments mid-project, or different hands with vastly different skill levels worked on adjacent sections. But that makes no sense. Master carvers don't abandon their finest work. Apprentices don't suddenly develop skills that eclipse their teachers. The local guides have a story naturally. They say the chief sculptor saw something in the stone, a vision or a prophecy that terrified him so deeply he dropped his tools and walked into the jungle, never to return. His assistants refused to continue his work, believing the carving was cursed. The unfinished section, they claim, was meant to remain incomplete as a warning. When I pressed for details about what the sculptor saw, the guides grew uncomfortable and changed the subject. I spent days photographing the transition zone from every angle, documenting the shift in technique. The completed sections, while beautiful, show the limitations of 12th century tools. You can see where chisels slipped slightly, where depth isn't quite consistent, where the artisan compensated for imperfections in the stone. Normal signs of human craftsmanship. The unfinished section shows none of this. The cuts are laser precise. The depth is mathematically consistent. It's as if someone with modern tools or knowledge far beyond their era worked on this stone. But what really disturbs me is the subject matter in the unfinished zone. While the completed portions show traditional mythological scenes, the abandoned section depicts something different. Figures that don't quite match the standard iconography. Symbols that don't appear anywhere else in Khmer art. And at the very edge of the unfinished work, barely visible unless you know where to look, a series of geometric patterns that resemble nothing so much as mathematical notation. I had an epigrapher examine photographs of these patterns. Her analysis was inconclusive but troubling. The symbols share characteristics with multiple ancient writing systems, Sanskrit, Pali, and something older she couldn't identify. They're not decorative, they're not random. They're encoding information. But without the completed context, without seeing where the narrative was meant to go, we can't decode what message the master sculptor was trying to preserve. And so the question remains, why did the most skilled artisan at Angkor Wat, at the height of his abilities, simply stop? What did he see in the stone or understand about the pattern he was carving that made him abandon his life's work? Because as I stood before that unfinished section, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't left incomplete by accident. It was left incomplete as a choice. I followed the ancient channels through the jungle for 3 days, mapping the hydraulic system that once fed Angkor Wat. The precision was staggering. Reservoirs, moats, and underground conduits that maintained perfect water levels year-round. But buried beneath the main moat, I found something that made no sense. Ceramic pipes with internal spiral grooves designed to create vortex flow. This wasn't discovered in Europe until the 19th century. So how did Khmer engineers master fluid dynamics 600 years early? The moat surrounding Angkor Wat isn't just defensive or decorative. It's a massive engineering project, 190 meters wide, forming a perfect rectangle around the temple complex. Modern surveys show it was designed to maintain a precise depth of 1.5 meters regardless of seasonal rainfall. During monsoon season, excess water drains through hidden channels. During dry months, underground conduits refill it from distant reservoirs. The system balanced itself automatically, without pumps, without human intervention, for centuries. Though when I examined the drainage channels more closely, I found something that shouldn't exist. Sections of ceramic pipe, each segment precisely fitted to the next, buried 3 meters below the moat bed. The pipes themselves are unremarkable at first glance, typical Khmer ceramics fired at high temperature. What stopped me cold were the interiors. Each pipe contains carefully carved spiral grooves running the entire length, creating a helical pattern that forces water into rotational flow. I know this design. every hydraulic engineer knows this design. It's called vortex flow technology, and it creates a self-cleaning system where water spirals through pipes with minimal friction and reduced sediment buildup. The principle wasn't understood in Europe until Victor Schauberger's research in the 1930s. Yet here it was, buried beneath a 12th century temple, working perfectly for 800 years. I cut a sample section, carefully, with permission from archaeological authorities, and sent it to a hydrodynamics lab in Singapore. The engineers there ran computational fluid dynamics simulations on the groove patterns. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Whoever designed these pipes understood laminar flow, turbulence reduction, and self-cleaning spiral dynamics at a level that matches modern engineering standards. The groove angles are optimized to within 2 degrees of theoretical ideals. This isn't trial and error craftsmanship. This is applied mathematics, but the spiral pipes are just the beginning. As I traced the water system further, I found pressure regulation chambers that use gravity and water weight to maintain constant flow rates. I found settling tanks with multiple filtration layers of gravel, sand, and charcoal, creating water purification systems that wouldn't look out of place in a modern treatment plant. I found distribution networks that used elevation changes and siphon principles to move water uphill without pumps. The entire complex functions as an integrated hydraulic machine, responding dynamically to changing conditions. When I mapped it in its entirety, I realized the water system contains more engineering sophistication than the temple buildings themselves. It's as if 2 different civilizations worked on Angkor Wat, one that built beautiful religious monuments, and another that understood fluid mechanics at a level that seems impossibly advanced for the medieval period. Local historians mention water management as a Khmer strength, but they describe it in terms of irrigation and rice farming, practical agriculture. What I found goes far beyond practical. This is theoretical knowledge applied with precision that suggests either extended experimentation over centuries or inherited knowledge from an earlier, more advanced source. I photographed everything, documented every measurement, collected GPS coordinates for each component. But as I compiled the data, one question kept surfacing. If the Khmer possessed this level of hydraulic engineering knowledge, what happened to it? Why didn't this technology spread? Why do we have no textbooks, no training manuals, no records of how they achieved this? It's as if the knowledge appeared fully formed, was implemented perfectly, and then vanished without trace when Angkor fell. And that impossibility leads me to wonder, just as with the floating stones and the impossible alignments, whether we're looking at the remnants of something far older than we've been taught to believe. Ground-penetrating radar doesn't lie, but it raised more questions than answers. Directly beneath the central Lotus Tower, 30 meters down, there's a void, not a natural cave, a constructed space with perfectly rectangular dimensions. Multiple expeditions have tried to reach it. All have failed. The Cambodian government sealed the area in 1997 after 3 researchers went missing during an unauthorized dig. What they found down there, if anything, remains classified. The discovery happened during a routine structural survey in 1994. A French team was assessing foundation stability when their ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly directly beneath the central sanctuary. The readings showed a chamber approximately 15 meters long, 10 meters wide, and at least 4 meters high. The walls appeared too regular, too geometric, to be natural formation. When they triangulated its position, they realized it sat precisely centered beneath the temple's main axis, aligned perfectly with the cosmic symbolism of the structure above. I've seen the original radar scans. They're stored in a university archive in Paris. Technically public record, but practically forgotten. The images are unmistakable. The chamber has right angles. It has what appears to be an entrance corridor sloping down from an unknown access point. And most intriguingly, the radar shows density variations within the chamber itself, suggesting it's not empty. Something is down there. The French team applied for excavation permits. The Cambodian authorities approved a limited exploratory dig. Work began in 1996, carefully excavating near the base of the central tower, following the corridor signature on the radar scans. They made it down 12 meters when they encountered the first sealed door, not a natural rock formation, a constructed barrier made from precisely fitted stone blocks with no mortar, the same technique used in the temple walls above. This is where the official record becomes frustratingly vague. According to the published report, the team decided to halt excavation pending further study. According to local workers who were there, something else happened. They speak of strange sounds coming from below once the seal was broken. Equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning wildly, and then 3 members of the research team descended into the partially opened corridor for what was supposed to be a brief survey. They never came back up. The rescue operation lasted 4 days. When authorities finally reached the location where the researchers should have been, they found the corridor empty. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of collapse or struggle, just empty stone passage leading deeper than anyone dared to follow. The dig was immediately terminated. The excavation was refilled. The area was marked off limits, and the 3 missing researchers were officially listed as having abandoned the project and left Cambodia. Except their families insist they never made contact again. Their bank accounts were never accessed. Their passports were never used. I've tried multiple times to get permission to survey the area again with modern equipment. Each request is politely denied. When I pressed for reasons, citing academic interest and improved safety protocols, a government official finally told me something off the record that I can't quite forget. Some doors were sealed for reasons beyond preservation. Perhaps they were meant to stay sealed. But here's what keeps me digging through archives and satellite imagery. The chamber beneath Angkor Wat isn't unique. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at other Angkorian sites, Angkor Thom, Ta Prohm, Preah Khan, show similar underground voids, all at roughly the same depth, all with similar geometric dimensions, all unexplored. It's as if the temples we can see, magnificent as they are, sit atop something older. Something buried, something that whoever built Angkor Wat knew about and built around but chose not to disturb. And if 3 experienced researchers could vanish in a corridor that leads to a chamber no one can explain, then perhaps the real mystery of Angkor Wat isn't what we can see in the galleries and towers above. Perhaps it's what lies below, waiting in the dark, sealed behind stone doors that were never meant to be opened. In the Northern Library, away from tourist paths, I discovered something that shook my understanding of the temple's history. A section of sandstone wall bears unmistakable signs of extreme heat exposure, not from fire, but from something that melted the rock surface into glass-like smoothness. The pattern suggests a directed energy source, yet no known medieval technology could produce such heat. Local guides call it the mark of divine anger. I call it unexplained. The affected area spans roughly 3 meters in diameter, centered on what appears to have once been a doorway. The sandstone, normally rough and porous, has been transformed into a glassy surface with a greenish tint. When I ran my hand across it, the texture was completely different from the surrounding stone, smooth as polished obsidian. More disturbing was the pattern. The melting is most intense at the center and gradually diminishes toward the edges, exactly what you'd expect from a focused heat source rather than a general fire. I collected samples, tiny fragments from the transition zone where normal sandstone becomes glass. A materials laboratory in Bangkok analyzed them using electron microscopy and spectroscopy. The results were troubling. The stone had been heated to temperatures exceeding 1,600 degrees Celsius, hot enough to liquefy sandstone and fuse it into a silicate glass. The heating happened rapidly, almost instantaneously, because there's no evidence of thermal stress or gradual transformation. For context, typical building fires reach maybe 800 degrees Celsius. Even modern industrial furnaces would struggle to heat a 3-meter section of solid rock wall this uniformly and this quickly. And here's what makes it truly bizarre. The melting only affects the surface. Beneath the glassy layer, the stone remains unchanged. Whatever caused this didn't radiate heat the way normal fire does. It was directional, focused, and incredibly intense. I found similar patterns in 2 other locations within the temple complex, one in the eastern gallery, another in a collapsed section of the outer wall. Each shows the same characteristics: rapid surface melting, glass-like transformation, no damage to surrounding areas. The locations form a rough triangle when plotted on a map, with the Northern Library incident at one vertex. I have no idea what that pattern might mean, but it doesn't feel random. The conventional explanation, when anyone bothers to offer one, is lightning strike. But I've seen lightning damage on stone structures. It creates fractures, explosive spalling, and scattered scorch marks. It doesn't create uniform melting over large surface areas, with gradually diminishing intensity toward the edges. Lightning is violent and chaotic. This was controlled and precise. A plasma physicist I consulted suggested the pattern resembles damage from directed energy weapons, the kind tested in modern military research. Focused microwave or laser systems that can heat material surfaces to extreme temperatures in fractions of a second. But that explanation raises more questions than it answers, because Angkor Wat was built in the 12th century, roughly 800 years before such technology existed. Local legends offer a different explanation. They speak of celestial battles fought above the temple during its construction, of divine beings wielding weapons that burned with the light of captured stars. The priests fled, the stories say, and when they returned, they found the walls scarred by godly fire. I dismissed these as metaphorical folklore until I saw the melted stone myself. Now I'm not sure what to believe. What troubles me most is the deliberate nature of it. The affected areas aren't structural. They're doorways, passageways, entry points. It's as if someone or something wanted to seal specific locations with heat so intense it fused the stone into an impenetrable barrier. And if that's true, then the question becomes, what were they trying to keep in or keep out? Because when I stand before that glassy wall, running my fingers across stone that was once molten, I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened here wasn't destruction. It was containment. And 8 centuries later, that seal still holds. I spent 2 weeks photographing every celestial symbol carved into the galleries. At first they seemed like decoration, stars and moons woven into the endless dance of apsaras and deities. But when I laid the photographs out in a dark guest house room, the fan ticking softly overhead, something unexpected emerged. The carvings were not random. They formed a system, a pattern, a record. What I held in my hands was not just art, it was an astronomical library written in stone. The first clue came from a series of repeating motifs in the Eastern Gallery. A circle with radiating lines, always accompanied by a crescent and a cluster of 7 small dots. The guides called it the Sun, the Moon, and the Pleiades. That in itself is not surprising. Many ancient cultures honored those stars. What caught my attention was the changing orientation of the cluster from panel to panel. Rotate those 7 dots on a star chart and you are not just depicting the Pleiades, you are recording their position in the sky at different times. I cross-referenced the panels with astronomical software, adjusting for precession, that slow wobble of Earth's axis over thousands of years. When I matched the orientations, an eerie alignment appeared. The sequence of carvings tracked not only the movement of the Pleiades, but also their relation to the ecliptic, the path the sun traces through the sky. The stone panels were not just symbolic, they were observational records, accurate within a margin that would make any medieval astronomer proud. As I examined more galleries, other patterns surfaced. In the northern cloister, a long frieze shows a series of discs with varying numbers of petals and arcs. At first glance, they look like stylized lotus flowers, but when I counted the petals and compared them across the sequence, a cycle emerged. 18 petals, 19, 18 again, then a sequence of 30, 29, 30. These are not random numbers. They match the Metonic cycle, the 19-year lunar calendar alignment, and the alternating pattern of lunar months. With the help of an epigrapher, I realized some of the so-called floral motifs were in fact encoded diagrams. The builders of Angkor Wat had carved the cycles of the moon, the length of the solar year, and even approximations of eclipse intervals into the temple walls. The sorrow cycle, the period after which eclipses repeat, appeared disguised as a repeating pattern of deities and animals, their count and spacing corresponding to that 18-year, 11-day rhythm. None of this appears in surviving Khmer texts. No astronomical treatises, no technical manuals. Officially, Angkor Wat is a religious monument, a symbolic representation of Mount Meru and the Hindu cosmos. And yet, the stone tells a more precise story, one that suggests sustained observation, calculation, and verification over generations. The temple is not just a model of the universe in a mythic sense. It is a data archive. What struck me most was how seamlessly this knowledge hides in plain sight. Tourists walk past these carvings every day, cameras clicking, pausing, to admire the beauty without realizing they are looking at tables and charts and equations translated into symbolic form. Priests chant in front of astronomical diagrams. Children play in the shadow of eclipse records. The science is so deeply woven into the sacred narrative that the two become indistinguishable. One evening, sitting on the edge of the Western Library as the sky turned from gold to indigo, I tried to imagine the minds behind this system. To encode precise astronomical information into religious art, you need more than observational skill. You need a philosophy that sees no divide between science and spirituality. To the builders of Angkor, tracking the motion of Venus or predicting an eclipse was not a separate discipline, it was an act of devotion. Modern scholars argue over the extent of Khmer astronomical knowledge. Some insist they borrowed from Indian traditions. Others claim independent development. Standing in those galleries, running fingers over stone that quietly preserves complex celestial mechanics, the debate feels too small. The real question is not where the knowledge came from. It is why they chose to hide it this way, scattered across walls, encoded in myth and pattern, instead of leaving straightforward records. Because as I pieced together more fragments, I began to notice something unsettling. Some of the cycles carved at Angkor Wat do not just describe ordinary celestial rhythms. They hint at longer patterns, great cycles of time spanning thousands of years. And those timelines, if interpreted correctly, lead toward something far stranger than simple calendrical tracking. A deeper rhythm that ties Angkor to other sites, other stones, and perhaps other forgotten epics. Using acoustic sensors, I mapped 7 hidden chambers within the temple walls that seemed to serve no structural purpose. But when monks chant at specific frequencies, these chambers amplify and distribute the sound through the entire complex in ways that seem almost designed. The chambers are tuned to different frequencies, creating a kind of architectural instrument. Yet no construction plans mention them. No inscriptions explain their purpose. I discovered the first chamber by accident, testing the acoustic phenomenon in the central tower. My equipment detected sound resonating not just in the main sanctuary, but emanating from a point deep within the north wall. I ran my hand along the stone, searching for seams or hollow spaces. The surface appeared solid, but the frequency readings were unmistakable. Something behind that wall was vibrating in sympathy with the chanting, responding like a tuning fork to a specific pitch. With permission from archaeological authorities, we used ground-penetrating radar to map the wall's interior. The scan revealed a void approximately 2 meters tall, 1 meter wide, and 3 meters deep. It was not a crack or natural formation. The chamber had been deliberately constructed, carved into the wall during original building, then sealed behind an outer layer of sandstone. The only opening was a narrow slot at the top, barely visible, designed to allow sound in but keep everything else out. What made this discovery extraordinary was the chamber's shape. It was not a simple rectangular void. The interior walls were angled and curved in precise geometric patterns, creating a complex acoustic cavity that would resonate at a very specific frequency. When I calculated the dimensions and ran acoustic modeling software, the results were clear. This chamber was designed to amplify sounds around 432 Hz, a frequency associated with certain Buddhist and Hindu chanting traditions. But that was just the first chamber. As I expanded my acoustic survey across the temple complex, I found 6 more, each one hidden within walls or beneath floors, each one tuned to a different frequency. Together they formed a scale, a musical progression spanning nearly 2 octaves. When I plotted their locations on a temple map, they were positioned at key points throughout the structure, creating a network that could distribute amplified sound across the entire complex. I waited for the next major ceremony, when monks would chant throughout the temple. I placed wireless sensors near each hidden chamber and one at the central altar. As the chanting began, my equipment lit up with activity. Each chamber responded to specific vocal frequencies, amplifying them and broadcasting them through narrow channels in the walls. The effect was extraordinary. A single monk chanting in the central sanctuary could be heard, crystal clear, in the outer galleries hundreds of meters away, not through echoes or normal sound propagation, but through this hidden amplification network. The system was so sophisticated that it included dampening chambers as well, small voids filled with what appeared to be packed earth and fiber, designed to absorb unwanted frequencies and prevent acoustic feedback. Whoever built this understood not just how to amplify sound, but how to control it, shaping the acoustic environment with the precision of a modern sound engineer. I consulted with an acoustic physicist who specializes in architectural acoustics. After reviewing my data, she made a comparison that sent chills down my spine. This is not medieval construction. This is concert hall engineering, the kind of thing we only learned to do in the 20th century with computers and precise measurement tools. These chambers are tuned, dampened, and positioned with mathematical accuracy that should not exist in 12th century architecture. But the deeper mystery is purpose. Why build such an elaborate system? Ceremonial use seems too simple an answer. The chambers are too precisely engineered, too carefully hidden, for mere ritual amplification. Some researchers have suggested they served as a communication network, allowing priests to send messages across the temple complex without being seen. Others propose acoustic healing, using specific frequencies to influence consciousness or physical well-being. What haunts me is a different possibility. That sound was not just being amplified and distributed, but stored. That these chambers, with their precise geometries and resonant properties, were designed to hold vibrations, to preserve them like a recording. 'Cause if the ancient builders understood acoustics at this level, if they could shape sound with such precision, then perhaps they knew something we have only recently rediscovered. That sound is not just air moving, it is energy, it is information and stone. Under the right conditions, can remember. Everyone photographs the magnificent Naga Serpent balustrades lining the causeway. What I noticed was their precise angular orientation. They don't point toward the temple entrance. When I traced their alignment using GPS and astronomical software, I discovered they point to a location 70 kilometers northwest, deep in unmarked jungle. I followed the bearing for 2 days. What I found there, well, that's another mystery I'm still trying to understand. The Naga balustrades are one of Angkor Wat's most iconic features. Massive stone serpents, their bodies forming railings along the western causeway, their heads rearing up at the entrance with mouths open as if ready to strike. Tour guides explain them as protective symbols, guardians against evil spirits, representations of the cosmic serpent from Hindu mythology. All of that is true, but it's not the whole truth. I first noticed the discrepancy while photographing the causeway at sunset. The serpent heads don't face the temple. They angle slightly to the left, about 7 degrees off axis. It's subtle enough that most visitors never notice. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Why would the builders, obsessed with symmetry and alignment in every other aspect of the temple, allow this apparent error? I set up a theodolite, a precision surveying instrument, and measured the exact bearing of the serpent heads. They aligned at 312 degrees from true north. I cross-referenced this with the temple's main axis, which runs at 305 degrees. The 7-degree difference was consistent, deliberate, not an accident of construction. The serpents were pointing somewhere specific. Using satellite imagery and topographic maps, I extended the bearing line northwest from Angkor Wat. It passed through dense jungle, small villages, and agricultural land before reaching a remote area in the Dangrek Mountains near the Thai border. According to maps, there was nothing there. No towns, no temples, no known archaeological sites. Just forest and limestone karst formations. But I had to know. The journey took 2 days by motorbike and then on foot, following GPS coordinates through increasingly difficult terrain. The jungle grew thicker, the paths less certain. Local villagers I asked about the area grew quiet, offering vague warnings about difficult spirits and bad luck. One elderly woman told me that her grandfather spoke of ruins in those hills, older than Angkor, but that people avoided them because travelers who went there sometimes came back changed, confused, unable to remember what they'd seen. When I finally reached the coordinates, I found stone, weathered, overgrown, barely visible beneath centuries of vegetation, but unmistakably carved. Not a temple, exactly, but a platform. A raised stone structure about 20 meters in diameter, its surface covered in symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't Khmer, they weren't Sanskrit, they looked older, more geometric, almost mathematical, and at the center of the platform, a stone circle with a perfectly round hole drilled straight down into the bedrock. I couldn't determine how deep the hole went. My flashlight beam disappeared into darkness. Dropping a stone, I counted nearly 5 seconds before hearing it hit bottom, suggesting a depth of over 100 meters. Who drills a precise vertical shaft that deep into solid limestone using 12th century tools? And more importantly, why? But here's what made my hand shake as I took photographs. The platform was aligned, its edges ran parallel to the cardinal directions with the same precision as Angkor Wat itself. And carved into the eastern face, worn but still visible, was the same 7-headed Naga serpent I'd seen on the causeway, its heads pointing back toward Angkor Wat. This wasn't a random ruin. This was a deliberate connection, a marker placed 70 kilometers away, aligned with the main temple through the orientation of stone serpents. But a marker for what? A boundary? A reference point? Part of a larger network of sites we haven't yet discovered? I spent hours at that platform, measuring, photographing, trying to understand. As the sun set and the jungle around me filled with evening sounds, I couldn't escape one troubling thought. If the serpents at Angkor Wat point here, where do the serpents here point? Because according to my compass, they aligned toward another bearing, continuing the line further northwest into even more remote territory. And if this is a network, a chain of connected sites marked by a lined stone, then Angkor Wat might not be the beginning or the end. It might be just one node in something much larger, much older, stretching across landscapes we've barely begun to explore. In a rarely visited corridor, I found a single block of granite. This stopped me cold because Angkor Wat is built entirely from sandstone and laterite. Granite doesn't exist naturally within 200 kilometers. The block weighs approximately 12 tons. It bears no carvings, no inscriptions, just smooth, polished surfaces. Why transport such massive weight, such distance for a single unmarked stone? And why hide it where almost no one would see it? The corridor lies in the southwestern corner of the outer gallery, a passage most tourists skip because it leads nowhere particularly photogenic. No elaborate bas-reliefs, no dramatic light, just plain walls and shadows. I only found it because I was systematically documenting every section of the temple, even the boring parts. And there, set into the floor at the corridor's end, flush with the surrounding sandstone, was a block of dark gray granite. The contrast was immediate. Sandstone has a warm golden tone and a slightly rough texture. This granite was cool to the touch, almost black in the dim light, polished to a mirror finish. I knelt beside it, running my hands across the surface, feeling for tool marks or inscriptions. Nothing. Just smooth stone, its surface so precisely flat that I couldn't slip a piece of paper beneath a straight edge laid across it. I measured the block. 2 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, roughly half a meter thick. Using density calculations for granite, I estimated its weight at around 12 tons. Moving a stone that heavy requires significant effort and equipment. The Khmer used elephants, wooden rollers, and thousands of workers to transport building materials, but they transported sandstone from quarries 40 kilometers away. The nearest granite deposits are in the Kulin Mountains, over 200 kilometers to the northeast. Why go to such extraordinary effort for a single block? The rest of Angkor Wat uses local sandstone and laterite materials available nearby. Granite appears nowhere else in the structure. Not in walls, not in foundations, not in decorative elements. Just this one block, hidden in an obscure corridor, serving no obvious structural purpose. I consulted geological surveys of the region. The granite from Kulin Mountains is distinctive, a coarse-grained rock with high quartz content and visible feldspar crystals. I took close-up photographs of the block and sent them to a geologist in Bangkok. His analysis confirmed what I suspected. This granite originated from Kulin, the same area where Angkor's sacred river begins. The same mountains considered the birthplace of the Khmer Empire. But Kulin granite has religious significance. It was used for lingas, sacred sculptures of Shiva, and other ritual objects. It was considered holy stone, imbued with spiritual power. To take such stone, transport it 200 kilometers, and then place it unmarked in a hidden corridor seems to violate every pattern of how the Khmer used materials. Sacred stones received carvings, dedications, elaborate context. This one has nothing, just polished surfaces and silence. I started exploring other possibilities. Maybe it's a foundation stone placed before construction began as a ritual anchor. But foundation stones typically sit at the center or cardinal points of structures, not tucked in peripheral corridors. Maybe it marks something buried beneath, a time capsule or sacred deposit. Ground-penetrating radar showed nothing unusual below it, just more sandstone foundation, consistent with the rest of the temple. Then I noticed something strange. The corridor containing the granite block aligns precisely with one of the hidden resonance chambers I'd discovered earlier. Not directly connected, but on the same axis, separated by several meters of solid wall. When I mapped all the anomalies I'd found, the floating stones, the melted walls, the hidden chambers, this granite block, a pattern emerged. They weren't randomly distributed, they formed a geometric arrangement, points on a design I couldn't quite decipher. I spent an evening sitting in that corridor as light faded, my back against the cool granite, thinking about effort and intention. Someone decided this stone mattered enough to justify the monumental task of moving it. Someone polished it to perfection, then hid it away. And someone, I realized, expected that eventually people like me would find it and ask why. Because the granite block isn't just different material, it's a marker, a deliberate anomaly placed where it doesn't belong. It's meant to be noticed by those paying attention. And once you notice it, you start questioning everything else. If they went to such lengths for this one unexplained stone, what other carefully hidden details have we missed? What other messages are waiting in the places we've stopped looking, camouflaged by 8 centuries of assumptions about what this temple is supposed to be? Deep in the southern library, behind a section of false wall I accidentally leaned against, I found a sealed ceramic vessel. It was too perfectly preserved, too deliberately hidden. Ground radar shows there are 17 more just like it, embedded throughout the temple complex in a pattern that mirrors the constellation Orion. They've never been opened. International law and local authorities forbid it. But the question burns, what did the temple builders want to preserve for future generations? The discovery happened during a routine documentation session. I was photographing bas-reliefs in the southern library when I leaned against what I thought was solid wall to steady myself. The stone shifted slightly, just a few millimeters, but enough to feel wrong. I pushed harder, and a section of wall, roughly 1 meter square, pivoted inward on a hidden axis. Behind it, recessed into a carved niche, sat a ceramic jar sealed with what appeared to be resin or wax. My first instinct was to document everything before touching anything. I photographed the vessel from every angle, measured its dimensions, noted its position. The jar stood about 40 centimeters tall, its surface unglazed but smooth, decorated with a simple band of geometric patterns near the rim. The seal appeared intact, unbroken after what must be 8 centuries. The preservation was remarkable, as if the niche had been designed to protect its contents from humidity, temperature changes, and time itself. I reported the find immediately to archaeological authorities. Within days, a team arrived with ground-penetrating radar to survey the temple systematically. What they discovered was extraordinary. The ceramic vessel I'd found wasn't unique. There were 17 more scattered throughout Angkor Wat, each hidden behind false walls, beneath floor stones, or sealed within hollow sections of columns. And when they plotted the locations on a site map, the pattern was unmistakable. The vessels formed the constellation Orion. 3 vessels in a line representing Orion's belt, 4 more marking the hunter's shoulders and feet, the rest filling in the constellation's outline with precision that couldn't be coincidental. The builders had deliberately encoded a star map into the temple's architecture, using hidden ceramic jars as markers. But why Orion? And more importantly, what's inside these vessels? Conventional archaeology demands careful excavation, proper documentation, controlled environment opening. International treaties protecting cultural heritage forbid unauthorized interference with sealed artifacts. The Cambodian government, already overwhelmed with managing and preserving Angkor's visible structures, has been reluctant to authorize opening the vessels. They remain sealed, cataloged, and untouched. But I thought about little else since that discovery. Time capsules are a modern concept, the deliberate preservation of objects or information for future discovery. Yet here we have what appears to be exactly that, created 800 years ago. The Khmer builders chose to hide these vessels, to encode their locations in stellar symbolism, and to seal them with materials designed for long-term preservation. This wasn't casual storage, this was intentional archiving. What would 12th century builders consider important enough to preserve this way? Religious texts seem unlikely. Those were carved in stone or written on palm leaf manuscripts stored in visible libraries. Sacred relics would typically be enshrined in stupas or placed in prominent temple locations not hidden. The astronomical symbolism suggests the contents might relate to celestial knowledge, calendrical systems or mathematical treatises. But that's speculation. The vessels keep their secrets. I've studied the ceramic composition. Local potters confirmed it matches clay from the Kulin region, fired at high temperature for maximum durability. The geometric patterns on the surface aren't purely decorative. When I analyze them with pattern recognition software, they contain repeating mathematical sequences, possibly encoding information about the contents or instructions for opening. But without access to the vessels themselves, translation remains guesswork. The Orion pattern adds another layer of mystery. Why that constellation specifically? Orion appears in mythologies worldwide, often associated with great hunters, gods, or cosmic gateways. In Hindu tradition, Orion connects to Prajapati, the lord of creatures. Some researchers link it to even older astronomical traditions that track Orion's position through the precession cycle. If the builders wanted to encode a date or mark a significant celestial event, Orion would be an excellent choice. But here's what troubles my sleep. These vessels were meant to be found. The false walls aren't impenetrable vaults. They're designed to be discovered by people curious enough, observant enough, to notice discrepancies. The Orion pattern ensures that once you find one vessel, you'll search for the others, and once you map them, you'll recognize the stellar arrangement. It's a breadcrumb trail left by people who understood that 8 centuries later, we would have the tools and knowledge to interpret what they preserved. So the question remains, what message did they consider so important that it required this elaborate preservation? And, more unsettling, if we finally open these vessels, will we understand what we find? Or will the contents raise more questions than answers, as every other mystery at Angkor Wat seems designed to do? Working with a botanist friend, I analyzed the plant life growing on the temple walls. We expected invasive species and common jungle vegetation. Instead, we found 7 plant species that shouldn't exist in Cambodia, varieties native to India, Indonesia, and even Madagascar. But here's what's strange. Genetic analysis shows they've been growing here for at least 400 years, yet they appear nowhere else in Southeast Asia. How did they arrive? Who cultivated them? And why? The first anomaly was a flowering vine clinging to the northern gallery walls. My botanist colleague stopped mid-stride when she saw it, pulling out her field guide and flipping through pages with increasing confusion. The plant matched no local species. Its leaf structure, flower morphology, and growth pattern resembled a variety of jasmine native to southern India, specifically the Western Ghats region over 2,000 kilometers away. But this wasn't a recent introduction. The vine had established itself deep into the stone, its roots penetrating cracks that take centuries to form. We collected samples carefully, documenting their locations with GPS coordinates. Back in her university lab, genetic analysis confirmed the Indian origin but revealed something more puzzling. The plant's DNA showed mutations and adaptations consistent with at least 4 centuries of isolated growth. This wasn't a modern transplant. These vines had been growing at Angkor Wat since at least the 17th century, possibly longer. But that was just the beginning. As we systematically surveyed the temple complex, we found 6 more botanical impossibilities. A fern species native to Java, a moss variety from Madagascar, an orchid that only grows naturally in the highlands of Sumatra, a medicinal herb from the Malabar coast of India, a flowering shrub from Borneo, and strangest of all, a small tree species that shouldn't exist anywhere. Its closest genetic relatives split between African and Southeast Asian populations separated by ocean and millions of years of evolution. Each species showed the same pattern: ancient establishment, genetic isolation, and geographic origin far from Cambodia. They weren't spreading beyond Angkor Wat's boundaries. They weren't hybridizing with local flora. They existed in small, stable populations, confined to specific areas of the temple, as if someone had planted them there intentionally, and they'd simply remained, generation after generation, in their assigned locations. The medicinal herb from India proved particularly intriguing. It grows in a sheltered courtyard near the Southern Library, a location that receives specific amounts of sunlight and rainfall that nearly match its native habitat. The positioning seemed too precise to be accidental. Someone had chosen that exact spot, understanding the plant's requirements, creating a microenvironment where it could survive thousands of kilometers from home. My colleague proposed a theory: botanical collection. Perhaps Angkor Wat served not just as a religious center, but as a living repository of useful plants gathered from across the ancient trade network. Temple gardens were common in many cultures, places where medicinal herbs, sacred plants, and rare specimens were cultivated for practical and spiritual purposes. The species we found all have documented uses in traditional medicine or religious rituals across South and Southeast Asia. But this theory has problems. If Angkor Wat housed a botanical garden, why do historical records never mention it? Why do the plants grow in scattered, seemingly random locations rather than organized garden plots? And most troubling, how did these species survive the temple's abandonment? When Angkor fell in the 15th century, the complex was largely deserted. Gardens require maintenance, especially exotic species far from their native ranges. Yet these plants persisted through centuries of neglect. I spent days observing how these botanical anomalies interact with the temple structure. The Indian jasmine grows only on north-facing walls, where morning sun hits at specific angles. The Javanese fern clusters near drainage channels that maintain consistent moisture. The Sumatran orchid roots itself in cracks that collect rainwater but drain quickly, preventing rot. Each species occupies a niche that allows survival without human intervention, as if the temple architecture was designed to sustain them. The small tree species, the one with the impossible genetics, grows in 3 locations that form a triangle around the central tower. Carbon dating of its oldest growth rings suggests an age of at least 350 years. But its genetic profile doesn't match any known species. It's either an extinct variety preserved here by accident or something deliberately bred, a hybrid created for unknown purposes and maintained in isolation while the rest of the world forgot it existed. What haunts me is the intentionality. These aren't invasive species that arrived by chance. They're carefully selected plants from distant regions, positioned in locations where they could survive independently, maintained by architecture that serves double duty as both temple and ecological support system. Someone designed this. Someone understood plant biology, microclimate management, and long-term preservation well enough to create a living archive that would outlast empires. But why preserve these specific species? What knowledge were they encoding in leaves and roots and genetic material that stone inscriptions couldn't capture? My compass started acting erratically the moment I crossed into the inner sanctum. Professional surveying equipment confirmed what I suspected. There are localized magnetic anomalies throughout the temple that interfere with modern instruments. Geologists have ruled out natural mineral deposits. The anomalies are too regular, too deliberately placed. It's as if the temple was designed to interact with Earth's magnetic field in ways we still don't understand. I first noticed it while trying to establish baseline measurements for my site map. My compass, a precision instrument I'd relied on for years across dozens of archaeological sites, began spinning slowly clockwise as I approached the central tower. Not wildly, not chaotically, but with steady rotation that accelerated the closer I moved to the sanctuary entrance. By the time I stood at the threshold, the needle was completing one full rotation every 3 seconds. At first, I assumed equipment failure. I tried a backup compass. Same behavior. A digital magnetometer showed magnetic field fluctuations of plus or minus 15 microteslas, far stronger than normal background variation. For context, Earth's magnetic field averages around 50 microteslas. What I was measuring represented a 30% deviation equipment and caused noticeable compass deflection. I mapped the anomaly systematically, taking readings every 2 meters throughout the temple complex. The data revealed a pattern. There were 12 distinct zones where magnetic fields deviated significantly from baseline. Each zone centered on specific architectural features: doorways, column bases, the corners of the central tower, and, curiously, 3 of the locations where I'd found the hidden ceramic vessels. The geophysicist I consulted examined my data remotely. His first question was whether there were iron deposits or magnetic minerals in the bedrock. Standard geological surveys of the Angkor region showed nothing unusual. The sandstone and laterite used in construction contained trace amounts of iron oxide, but nowhere near enough to create anomalies of this magnitude. He suggested I collect rock samples for magnetic susceptibility testing. The results were baffling. The stones showed no unusual magnetic properties. They were ordinary sandstone and laterite, compositionally identical to surrounding quarry stone. Yet when placed within the temple structure in those specific locations, they generated measurable magnetic anomalies. Remove the stones from the temple and the magnetic signature disappeared. Place them back and it returned. The stones weren't magnetic. The configuration was. This led to an uncomfortable conclusion. The builders deliberately arranged non-magnetic materials in patterns that create magnetic effects through structural geometry. In modern physics, we can achieve this with precisely wound coils and electrical currents, creating electromagnets. But Angkor Wat has no metal coils, no power source, nothing that conventional science would identify as capable of generating magnetic fields. Yet the fields exist, measurable and repeatable. I found historical references to similar phenomena at other ancient sites. The Great Pyramid exhibits magnetic anomalies in certain chambers. Stonehenge shows localized field variations. Teotihuacan has zones where compasses behave erratically. Some researchers dismiss these as measurement errors or natural geological quirks. Others suggest they're evidence of knowledge we've lost, an understanding of how to manipulate Earth's magnetic field using stone architecture alone. But Angkor Wat's anomalies have an additional feature. They're not static. I took measurements at different times of day and different seasons. The magnetic field strength varies in a regular cycle, strongest at dawn and dusk, weakest at midday and midnight. The pattern follows solar position, not because of temperature effects, those were controlled for, but as if the structure responds to the sun's angle relative to Earth's magnetic field. One of the strongest anomalies occurs directly above the sealed chamber I'd discovered earlier, the rectangular void 30 meters beneath the central tower. Standing at that location with a magnetometer, the needle oscillates rapidly, indicating a fluctuating field rather than a stable one. It's as if something down there is active, pulsing, generating a magnetic signature that penetrates 30 meters of solid rock. I started researching historical accounts of the temple. Ancient chronicles mention that certain locations within Angkor Wat were forbidden to common people, reserved only for initiated priests who underwent specific training. The chronicles describe meditation practices performed at designated spots, practices that supposedly allowed practitioners to perceive subtle energies and achieve altered states of consciousness. Modern interpretation treats this as spiritual metaphor. But what if the priests were detecting these magnetic anomalies? What if they understood, empirically if not scientifically, that specific locations within the temple generated fields that affected human physiology? Studies have shown that exposure to variable magnetic fields can influence brain activity, particularly in regions associated with spatial orientation and temporal perception. Standing in these anomaly zones, I felt disoriented, experienced time distortions where minutes seemed to stretch or compress. I initially attributed this to suggestion or fatigue, but when I brought others to the same locations without telling them what to expect, they reported similar sensations: dizziness, altered time perception, vivid mental imagery. The question that keeps me returning to these magnetic zones is purpose. Were the builders creating navigation markers, invisible reference points detectable only with instruments we didn't develop until centuries later? Were they encoding information in magnetic patterns, a form of data storage we simply don't know how to read? Or were they doing something stranger, manipulating fields that affect consciousness itself, creating architectural spaces where human perception shifts in ways that seemed magical then and remain unexplained now? This one still keeps me awake at night. The famous face towers of the Bayon Temple nearby are well documented, but Angkor Wat has faces too, subtle, hidden in the shadows of certain corridors. What disturbs me is that they appear different depending on the time of day and season. I have photographs from different months showing the same stone surface revealing different expressions, different features. Pareidolia can't explain this. The carvings are too deliberate, too precisely aligned with solar angles to be coincidence. I discovered the first face during late afternoon in the Western Gallery. Shadow fell across a section of wall in a way that suddenly revealed what looked like eyes, a nose, a mouth. I assumed it was my imagination, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But something made me photograph it anyway, documenting the exact time and sun position. When I returned 3 hours later, the face had vanished, just plain stone, no features at all. Over the following months, I made it a practice to photograph that same wall section at different times: dawn, midday, sunset, even by moonlight. What I discovered was remarkable. The face appeared only during specific lighting conditions, when sunlight struck at angles between 20 and 30 degrees from horizontal. Outside that range, the wall looked blank. Within it, features emerged with startling clarity. Not crude suggestions of a face, but detailed carvings showing realistic proportions, subtle emotional expression, even the texture of skin. But here's what made it truly strange. The face changed. Photographs from January showed a young face, smooth features, eyes wide and alert. By March, the same wall revealed an older face, lines around the eyes, a more weathered expression. June brought a different face entirely, broader features, different bone structure, as if a completely different person had been carved there. Yet the wall itself showed no signs of alteration. No fresh chisel marks, no evidence of recarving. I found 11 more of these changing faces scattered throughout the temple, each one visible only under specific lighting conditions, each one showing different features at different times of year. I documented them obsessively, creating time-lapse compilations that showed the same stone surface cycling through different phases as seasons progressed. When I showed this footage to other researchers, their reactions ranged from fascination to disbelief. The conventional explanation is pareidolia enhanced by confirmation bias. Once you expect to see faces, your brain obligingly finds them in random shadows and textures. I understand this argument. I've spent years training myself to separate genuine archaeological features from wishful interpretation. But these faces are too consistent, too repeatable. Other observers, given no information about what to look for, photograph the same faces at the same times and describe the same features. I consulted with a sculptor who specializes in relief carving. I showed him photographs of one wall section under different lighting. His analysis was technical and unsettling. The stone surface has been carved in multiple depths, he explained. Shallow reliefs that only become visible at certain shadow angles. Deeper cuts that create different features when lit from other directions. It's like multiple images layered onto the same surface, each one designed to appear under specific conditions. This isn't accidental weathering. This is sophisticated optical engineering. But why? Why create faces that hide and reveal themselves based on sun position? Why encode multiple images into single surfaces? The effort required would be enormous, the planning meticulous. The carvers would need to understand solar geometry, shadow projection, and human visual perception at levels that seem impossibly advanced for the 12th century. I began mapping the faces according to when they appeared. The young faces showed during the dry season, older faces during the wet season. Some faces appeared only during equinoxes or solstices. The pattern suggested a calendar, a way of marking time using sunlight and stone instead of written records. But a calendar of what? Certainly not agricultural cycles. Those don't require hidden faces in temple corridors. One researcher I consulted suggested ancestor worship. Perhaps the changing faces represent lineages, family trees encoded in stone where each season reveals a different generation. The theory has merit. Khmer culture placed tremendous importance on ancestral connections. But if that's the case, why hide it? Why not create permanent, visible portraits like other cultures did? Another theory proposes esoteric knowledge. Secret teachings passed down through initiated priests who learned to read the temple's hidden messages. The faces could mark locations for meditation, spots where specific practices should be performed at specific times. Ancient texts mention training that involved learning to perceive subtle patterns, to see what remains hidden to ordinary observation. Perhaps these changing faces were tests, ways to verify that students had developed the necessary perceptual skills. What haunts me most is the technical achievement. Creating relief carvings visible only under specific lighting requires understanding three-dimensional geometry, optics, and solar mechanics at levels we associate with Renaissance artists or modern designers. The carvers would need to visualize how shadows would fall throughout the year, how depth and angle combine to create or erase features, how the human eye interprets ambiguous forms under different conditions. This is computational thinking. executed in stone. I've spent hours sitting in those corridors, watching faces emerge and dissolve as light shifts. Sometimes I wonder if I'm seeing what the builders intended, or if I'm only catching fragments, partial glimpses of a larger design I lack the knowledge to fully perceive. Because if they could hide faces this skillfully, what else is hidden in these walls? What other images appear under conditions I haven't tested, angles I haven't considered, combinations of light and season and observer position I haven't discovered yet? The temple keeps its secrets in plain sight, revealing them only to those patient enough, observant enough to wait for the right moment when stone decides to speak. I've walked these corridors for months now, notebook in hand, camera around my neck, always searching for answers. Each mystery I've uncovered at Angkor Wat has only deepened the questions. The floating stones that defy physics, the acoustic chambers that shouldn't exist, the alignments pointing to dates thousands of years before construction, the sealed chamber beneath the tower, the melted walls, the astronomical library encoded in stone, the hidden resonance network, the Serpent balustrades pointing to ruins in unmarked jungle, the granite block that traveled 200 kilometers for no apparent reason, the ceramic vessels arranged like stars, the impossible plants, the magnetic anomalies, the faces that change with seasons. 15 mysteries, and not one of them fully explained by conventional history. Taken individually, each could be dismissed as coincidence, misinterpretation, or the inevitable gaps in our understanding of ancient cultures. But taken together, they form a pattern, a suggestion that Angkor Wat is not quite what we've been taught to believe. The standard narrative says this temple was built in the 12th century by King Suryavarman II as a monument to Vishnu and a demonstration of Khmer imperial power. All of that is true. The historical evidence is solid. But I'm beginning to suspect it's not the complete truth. Perhaps the Khmer didn't build Angkor Wat from nothing. Perhaps they rebuilt it, restored it, constructed their temple atop foundations and knowledge from something far older, something that encoded wisdom we're only beginning to rediscover. The mysteries don't feel like construction errors or happy accidents. They feel like messages, breadcrumbs left by people who understood that knowledge can be preserved in stone more permanently than in manuscripts or oral traditions. They knew that curious minds would eventually ask the right questions, notice the anomalies, piece together the patterns, and they were patient enough to wait 8 centuries for us to develop the tools, the science, and the willingness to look beyond accepted explanations. Standing in the central tower as dawn breaks, watching light spill across galleries and courtyards, I'm struck by how much we still don't know. How many corridors remain unexplored? How many sealed chambers lie beneath our feet? How many patterns wait to be discovered by someone paying attention in just the right way at just the right moment? Angkor Wat doesn't whisper its secrets, it waits. Patient as stone, certain that eventually someone will learn to ask the questions it was built to answer. I thought I came here to document mysteries. Now I realize I've only begun to understand how deep they go. This temple isn't just a monument to the past, it's a puzzle box designed for the future, and we've barely started opening it. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I've learned one thing on this path. History doesn't whisper, it waits. And Angkor Wat will be here, holding its mysteries close, long after we're gone, ready for the next explorer brave enough to look beyond the guidebooks and ask what really lies hidden in these ancient stones.